The air in the cave on Saipan was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the damp, earthy smell of fear. It was late June 1944, and the world outside had been reduced to the deafening symphony of American artillery. For Akiko Tanaka, a nurse no older than 20, this cavern was both a hospital and a tomb. The groans of the wounded soldiers of the 43rd Division were the only clock she had, each pained breath marking another moment stolen from the inevitable. Sunlight was a distant memory, replaced by the flickering dance of a single kerosene lamp that threw long, skeletal shadows against the limestone walls. Outside, Lieutenant General Holland, Howlin' Mad Smith's Marines were tightening their grip, a relentless iron fist closing around the island's heart. News, fragmented and grim, trickled down from the command post where General Saito and Admiral Nagumo directed their hopeless defense. The Grand Fleet was defeated in the Philippine Sea. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no escape. All that remained was the Emperor's final expectation: death before dishonor. Akiko cleaned a wound with a rag dipped in boiled seawater, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. The soldier, a boy with the ghost of a mustache, stared at the cave ceiling. "Is it true?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "They say the American devils boil their prisoners alive." Akiko offered no reply. She had heard the same stories, propaganda meant to steal their resolve, to ensure no one would surrender. But as the shells screamed closer, the stories felt less like propaganda and more like a coming prophecy. The end came not with a bang, but with a sudden, terrifying silence. The shelling stopped. In its place came the crunch of boots on loose rock and harsh, guttural shouts in a language she didn't understand. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, blinding her. The wounded who could move reached for their rifles, their last act of defiance. The crack of American M1 Garands was sharp and final in the enclosed space. Hands grabbed her, pulling her out into the blinding, smoke-filled daylight. The world was a canvas of gray ash and shattered green jungle. Towering, helmeted men surrounded her. The Oni, the devils from the stories. One of them, shorter than the others but with the same weary, dust-caked face, knelt before her. To her astonishment, he spoke in perfect, formal Japanese. "My name is Sergeant Sato," he said, his eyes holding a strange mixture of pity and duty. "You are now a prisoner of the United States Armed Forces. Do not resist." Akiko stared, her mind a vortex of shock and shame. To be captured was the ultimate disgrace, a fate worse than death. As she was led away with a handful of other female survivors, the soldier's whisper echoed in her mind. "They boil them alive." She looked at the impassive faces of her captors, and for the first time she truly believed it. The march to the prisoner enclosure was a journey through hell. The sweet, sickly smell of death hung heavy in the tropical air, a miasma of Japanese and American bodies left where they fell. Akiko kept her eyes fixed on the dusty boots of the woman in front of her, trying to block out the shattered landscape. This was the island she had been told was an unsinkable fortress, a bastion of the Emperor's divine will. Now, it was just a graveyard churned by steel. The camp was a hastily erected pen of barbed wire near the coast, little more than a stretch of sand and coral under the merciless sun. Tents were being set up, but for now the prisoners, a dazed collection of soldiers, conscripted laborers, and a few women and children, were herded into the open. Akiko huddled with the other nurses, their white uniforms now stained gray and brown. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. They had failed. They had allowed themselves to be captured. Captain Miller, a man whose exhaustion was etched into the lines around his eyes, stood with Sergeant Sato, observing the new arrivals. "Ken, we need to process them," Miller said, his voice raspy from dust and shouting. Separate the civilians from the military. Get names. We need to know who we've got." Sergeant Sato nodded, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He approached the group of nurses. "Please," he began in Japanese, his tone gentle, "we must record your names and occupations for the International Red Cross. It is for your own safety." Silence. The women stared back at him, their faces a mixture of terror and contempt. To them, he was a traitor, a dog with a Japanese face speaking the enemy's words. One of the older nurses spat on the ground near his feet. "They believe we will torture and kill them," Sato explained quietly to Miller, not turning his head. "They have been told it is their duty to die, not to speak to us." Miller sighed, running a hand over his crew cut. "We don't have time for this. We're still taking fire from holdouts in the hills, and command is getting reports. Ugly ones." He gestured vaguely to the north, toward Marpy Point. "General Saito has issued his final order, a Gyokusai charge. He wants every living Japanese on this island, soldier or civilian, to kill themselves rather than surrender." Later that afternoon, a Marine brought crates of sea rations. Sato opened a can of peaches and offered it to Akiko. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he simply placed the can on the sand before her. She stared at it. The propaganda said the Americans were monsters. But monsters didn't offer sweet fruit to their prisoners. Hesitantly, her hand trembling, she picked it up. The sweet, syrupy taste was an explosion in her starved mouth, a shocking act of humanity in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. It was a kindness so unexpected it felt like a trick, and the seed of a terrifying new question began to sprout in her mind. If the stories were lies, what else was a lie? The following days blurred into a haze of sun, thirst, and gnawing anxiety. But it was a sound, carried on the wind from the north, that truly broke the grim monotony. It wasn't the sound of battle. It was a chaotic symphony of wailing, of shouts that weren't orders, and a strange, rhythmic chanting that made the hair on Akiko's arms stand up. In the command tent, Captain Miller slammed down a field telephone. "God damn it," he muttered, his face pale. He turned to Sergeant Sato. "It's happening. Marpy Point. They're jumping." Sato felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He and Miller raced in a jeep toward the northern cliffs, the desperate sounds growing louder. When they arrived, the scene was one of incomprehensible horror. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, men, women carrying infants and children, were gathered at the edge of the limestone precipice. Far below, the turquoise waves of the Pacific crashed against the rocks. Japanese soldiers stood among them, some holding grenades, others urging the families forward. The chanting was a final defiant "Banzai" for the emperor. "Get on the horn, Sato," Miller yelled over the wind and the cries. "Tell them not to do it. Tell them we'll take care of them." Sato grabbed the loudspeaker, his hands shaking. He felt the chasm of his own identity open before him. A Japanese face in an American uniform, screaming in his parents' tongue to save people who saw him as a demon. "Minasan, kite kudasai," he boomed, his voice echoing across the chasm. "Please, listen. The war is over for you. We are not your enemy. We have food, water, medicine. We will not harm you. Please, step back from the cliff." A few people hesitated, turning toward the sound of his voice. But then a soldier would shout, or a father would pull his family closer, and the moment would be lost. Akiko, back in the camp, could only listen to the ghastly sounds carried on the wind. Later, a new group of prisoners was brought in, survivors who had been pulled back from the edge by Marines. A woman sat rocking back and forth, her eyes vacant. "They just jumped," she whispered to no one in particular. "The Takeda family. They held hands. The children were crying. Mr. Takeda bowed to the soldiers, and then they all jumped together. Gyokusai, for the Emperor. That night, Akiko wrote in a small diary she had managed to keep hidden, her pencil strokes sharp and angry in the dim light. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, July 8, 1944. They called it an honorable death. I saw no honor today. I heard only the screams of children. The propaganda told us to fear the enemy, but what if the true monster was the pride that asks a mother to throw her baby into the sea? We were told surrender is shame. But is it more shameful than this? I am a prisoner. I am alive. And I am more afraid than I have ever been. Not of the Americans. I am afraid of the ghosts of those who chose honor. The days following the horror at Marpy Point were draped in a suffocating silence. The screams from the cliffs had ceased, but they echoed in the minds of everyone in the camp, a ghost sound that was worse than any artillery barrage. The prisoners who had been pulled from the ledge were like statues, their eyes hollowed out by what they had witnessed. Akiko tried to tend to them, but their wounds were not of the flesh. They were wounds of the soul, and for those she had no medicine. The atmosphere grew more tense when a new directive came down from the American command. Captain Miller, his face grim, read the dispatch and swore under his breath. "Typhus," he said to Sergeant Sato. "A few cases confirmed in the 2nd Marine Division. They think it's coming from lice on the prisoners. We've got orders to delouse every single one of them. Now." Marines arrived with heavy canisters and hand pump sprayers that looked menacingly unfamiliar. They began herding the male prisoners, who were forced to strip and be sprayed with a white, chemical-smelling powder. There were shouts, confusion, and resistance, but it was done with brutal efficiency. Then, it was the women's turn. Akiko and the other nurses were separated from the main group and led to an isolated section of the beach, enclosed by a new line of concertina wire. Captain Miller stood with his arms crossed, impatience radiating from him. "Sato, I don't have all day. We need this done fast. No arguments." Sato swallowed hard, his gaze falling on the terrified faces of the women. He knew what this would look like. He knew the stories they'd been told. He tried to explain. "Captain, this will be difficult. To them, being stripped is the ultimate humiliation. It's worse than—" "I don't care." Miller cut him off, his voice sharp. "The health of my men comes first. Just give them a simple order. Tell them to make a line. Tell them to kneel down so the men can spray their heads and shoulders. And tell them to close their eyes so the powder doesn't blind them." He gestured to a Marine with a sprayer. "Get it done." Sato felt like a traitor to two nations at once. He walked toward the women, his boots sinking into the sand. His heart pounded against his ribs. He looked at Akiko, at her wide, frightened eyes, and saw the face of his own cousin back in California. He cleared his throat, and the words came out, flat and dead, devoid of the emotion that was tearing him apart. "Mina-san," he began, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. The women fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "You will form a single line. You will obey the order." He paused, the words catching in his throat. He saw the Marines ready their sprayers. He saw Captain Miller's impatient glare. He took a breath and delivered the final terrible sentence. "Kneel down and close your eyes." A collective gasp went through the small group. This was it, the moment they had been warned about. This was the dishonor, the execution. Akiko felt her knees go weak. This was the price of her cowardice, of her failure to die on the battlefield. One by one, the women sank to their knees in the sand. Akiko followed, her movements stiff and robotic. She knelt, straightened her back as she had been taught, and squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the crack of a rifle or the cold steel of a bayonet. She thought of her mother, of the cherry blossoms in her village. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The world narrowed to the sound of her own frantic heartbeat and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. Akiko knelt in the sand, her back rigid, every muscle tensed for the impact. She heard a coarse voice bark a command in English. This was it, the final moment. Her life replayed not in images, but in feelings. The warmth of her mother's hand, the pride of receiving her nursing cap, the gnawing hunger of the past weeks, and now, this paralyzing, absolute terror. Then came not a bang, but a sharp hiss. A cold, fine mist settled over her hair and the back of her neck. It was followed by a puff of white powder that billowed around her shoulders, carrying an acrid chemical smell. It was invasive, humiliating, but it was not death. It didn't burn. There was no pain, only the cold, clinging dust. Slowly, hesitantly, she dared to open her eyes. The Marine who had stood behind her was already moving to the next woman in line, his face impassive as he worked the pump on the sprayer. Another hiss, another cloud of white dust. One by one, the other women were opening their eyes, looking at each other with expressions of stunned, absolute bewilderment. A few began to weep, not from fear, but from the sudden, violent release of it. The execution they had prepared their souls for had been a delousing. The greatest shock was not that they had been spared. The shock was the depth of the lie they had been living. The monstrous barbaric Oni who were supposed to torture and execute them with gleeful cruelty were instead clinically and impersonally dusting them with insecticide to prevent the spread of typhus. The order to kneel and close your eyes wasn't a prelude to a massacre. It was a practical, almost mundane instruction to avoid getting powder in their eyes. Sergeant Sato watched, his shoulders slumping in a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He met Akiko's gaze across the small distance. In her eyes, he saw not hatred, but a dawning, agonizing comprehension. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the abyss they had all just stared into. Captain Miller cleared his throat. "Well," he said to Sato, his voice quieter than usual, "that's one way to break a fever." The comment was gruff, but it lacked its usual edge. Even he seemed to grasp the enormity of the moment that had just passed. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Akiko sat by the wire fence, looking out at the calm Pacific. The shame of survival was slowly, painfully being replaced by the burden of it, the burden of knowledge. She thought of the soldiers in her cave who chose a final grenade, of the families who held hands and stepped off the cliffs at Marpy Point, all dying for a lie she had almost believed herself. She touched the lingering powder in her hair. It felt like the dust of a world that had crumbled to ash. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, July 9th, 1944, they told us the enemy would defile our spirits before they killed our bodies. Today, we knelt for our execution and held our breath for the end. We were not killed. We were cleaned, dusted like old furniture. Is this the dishonor we were meant to die for? The order was, kneel and close your eyes. I thought it was an order to die. I was wrong. It was an order to be born again, into a world where I no longer know what is honorable or what is true. I only know that I am alive.